but technology is the real skin of our species. Man, correctly seen in the context of the last 500 years, is an extruder of a technological shell. We take in matter that has a low degree of organization. We put it through mental filters and we extrude Lindisfarne Gospels, space shuttles, all of these things. This is what we do. We're like coral animals embedded in a technological reef of extruded psychic objects. And the tool is the flying saucer, or the soul exteriorized in three-dimensional space. It's, as James Joyce said, it's the problem of how man may be dirigible, right? And how man may be dirigible is basically by turning himself inside out. In other words, the body must become an interiorized hologrammatic object embedded in a solid-state hyperdimensional matrix, which is eternal, so that man wanders through Elysium in his body. This is a kind of Islamic paradise that I'm putting out here. Wanders through Elysium in his body, experiencing all the pleasures of the flesh, but not realizing that he is a holographic projection of a solid-state matrix that is micro-miniaturized, superconducting, and nowhere to be found. It is part of the plenum. And all history is about producing prototypes of this situation with greater and greater closure toward the ideal, so that airplanes, automobiles, condominiums, space shuttles, space colonies, starships of the hardware, speed of light, spin dizzy drive type, all of these are, as Mircea says, self-transforming images of flight that speak volumes about man's aspiration to self-transcendence, so that our wish, our salvation, and our only hope, basically, is to end the historical crisis by becoming the alien, by ending alienation, by recognizing the alien as the self, in fact, recognizing the alien as an overmind which holds all the physical laws of the planet intact in the same way that you hold an idea intact in your mind. In other words, all these givens which are thought to be so writ in adamantine are actually merely the moods of the God, if you will, which we happen to be. And the whole thing about human history is recovering this piece of lost information so that man may be dirigible. Or, again, to quote Finnegan's Wake, Moycane is the red light district of Dublin. Here in Moycane we flop on the seamy side, but up in the Ent, prospector, you sprout all your worth and you woof your wings. So if you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. It's that simple, you see. But it takes courage to be parked when the Grim Reaper draws near. A blessing in disguise, Joyce calls him. So, to me, what psychedelics point out, and where I think society will go once they are integrated to the point where large groups of people can plan research programs without fear of being persecuted for it, is it models the after-death state. It may do more than model it. It may essentially reveal the nature of it, that our mind, what we each call our mind, can be, the modalities of appearance and understanding can be shifted so that we see it within the context of the one mind. And then problems like the existence of extraterrestrials and that kind of thing become trivial, because the one mind that I'm talking about contains all experiences of the other. All experiences of the other. There is not the Newtonian universe deployed throughout the parsecs and kiliocosms of physical space and the interior mental universe. They are the same thing. We perceive them as unresolvable dualisms because of what is called, or what I call a code, the quality of the code, meaning the language we use to discuss this problem has these built-in dualisms. I mentioned this book, The Invisible Landscape, that my brother and I wrote, and I'll say just a bit about it because it relates to what's been said. I spoke in general terms about the technology which would interiorize the body, exteriorize the soul, spoke of it as a long-term technological goal, meaning visible within the next 100 or so years, following on to space travel, that sort of thing. But what the invisible landscape is about is an effort to short-circuit that chronology and to actually, in a certain sense, force the issue. It's the story, or rather it's the intellectual underpinnings of the story of an expedition to the Amazon by my brother and myself and several other people in 1971, in which my brother formulated an idea that involved using harmine and harmaline. These are compounds which occur in Banisteriopsis caapi, which is the woody vine that is the basis for ayahuasca. And ayahuasca is one of these plant hallucinogens that releases you into this dimension I'm discussing. An effort to use harmine in conjunction with the human voice in what we called the experiment at La Chorrera, which was basically, you can take it as very loose science or very tight magic, but it was an effort to use sound to charge the molecular structure of these harmine molecules metabolizing in vivo in the body in such a way that they would bind preferentially into certain molecular structures. Our candidate at the time was DNA. I think Frank Barr has convinced me that there's as great a likelihood that it involves binding into melanin bodies is as likely a possibility as that it involves DNA, but it involves binding into a molecular site where information is stored, so that this information is then broadcast essentially in the mind in such a way that you begin to get a readout on the structure of the soul. In other words, this was an effort to use a kind of shamanic technology to bell the cat, if you will, to hang a superconducting, telemetric, psychedelic device on the overmind so that there would be a continuous readout of information from this dimension. And the success or failure of this you may judge by reading the book, because the first half of the book describes the experiment, the theoretical underpinning of the experiment. The second half of the book describes the theory of the structure of time that derived from the bizarre mental states that followed upon the experiment. I don't claim that we succeeded. I just claim that our theory of what happened is better than any theory any of our critics have been able to bring forward. But whether we succeeded or not, that kind of thinking points the way. In other words, when I speak of the technology of building the starship, I imagine it will be done with voltages far below the voltage of a common flashlight battery. This is, after all, where the voltages, where the most interesting phenomenon go on in nature. Thought is that kind of phenomenon. Metabolism is that kind of phenomenon. So I think that, an Aquarian science, or a science that places the psychedelic experience at the center of its program of investigation, should move toward a practical realization of this goal. The goal of eliminating the barrier between the ego and the overself so that the ego can perceive itself as an expression of the overself, so that the anxiety of being cast into matter, of apparently facing a tremendous biological crisis in the form of death, of apparently facing a tremendous physical species crisis in the form of the apocalypse, the crisis of limitation in physical space by being planet-bound, all of these things can be obviated by cultivating the soul, basically, by practicing shamanism using these tryptamine drugs that I've described. And my plea to scientists, administrators, and politicians who may be listening to my voice is to look again at psilocybin, to not lump it with the other psychedelics, to realize that it is a phenomenon unto itself, and it has an enormous potential for transforming mankind, not simply transforming the people who take it, but it is like an art movement or a mathematical understanding or a scientific breakthrough. It holds the possibility of transforming the entire society simply by virtue of the information that is coming through. This is a source of gnosis, and the voice of gnosis has been silenced in the Western mind for at least 1,000 years. Let me see. Well, I think that this object, as a friend of mine said, history is the shockwave of eschatology. In other words, we are living in a very unique moment, 10 or 20,000 years long, where this immense transition is happening, and the object at the end of and beyond history, which is the human species transformed into this eternal superconducting overmind spacecraft thing, is casting a shadow back through time. And all religion, all philosophy, all wars, pogroms, persecutions are because people do not get the message right. And that's because there is both the forward-flowing casuistry of being, causal determinism, and the interference pattern that is formed against that by the backward-flowing fact of this eschatological hyper-object throwing its shadow across the landscape. So we exist, there is a great deal of noise. This situation called history is totally unique. It will only last for a moment. It began a moment ago, it will only last for a moment. But in that moment, there is like this tremendous burst of static as the monkey goes to godhood, and there is this crossing of the I don't like to call it the casuistry, but the efficacy of the eschaton, this final eschatological object, and the forward flow of entropic circumstance. Does that get it for you? Maybe.
Well, I have a little bit of trouble of, thinking kind of like which came first. Are you saying the chicken or the egg? Are you saying that this over-consciousness has something to do with...
Well, I'm certainly saying that life is necessary. That life is... It is not the idea that we have been skewed onto a siding called organic existence and that our actual place is in eternity. No, there is something about, this is a very important part of the cycle. It is a filter. Remember, I mentioned that I thought that there was the possibility of extinction. There was the possibility of falling into physis forever. And so in that sense, the metaphor of the fall is valid. There is a spiritual obligation. There is a task to be done. It isn't, though, simply something as simple-minded as following a set of somebody else's rules. It's that the noetic enterprise is a primary obligation of being in this circumstance. And your salvation is linked to it. Because if you do, and not everyone has to read alchemical texts or study superconducting biochemistry to make the transition. Most people make it naively by thinking clearly about the present at hand. But we are intellectuals trapped in a world of too much information. Innocence is gone for us. We cannot expect to cross the rainbow bridge through the act of a good act of contrition. That won't be sufficient. We have to understand. And I recall, Whitehead said, understanding is the apperception of pattern as such, because to fear death is to not understand what's going on. And to even see it as a big deal is to not understand what's going on, although I don't claim to have reached that exalted plane. But cognitive activity is the defining fact of humanness. Language, thought, analysis, art, poetry, myth-making, these are the things that point the way toward the realm of being of the eschaton. That is what Joyce means when he says man may become dirigible. In other words, man may be released into a realm of pure engineering. The imagination is everything. This was Blake's perception. This is where we come from. This is where we're going. And it is only to be approached through cognitive activity, I think.
Really, George.
Can you comment on the importance of your discussion of the I Ching in your book?
Well, very briefly, because I always have the feeling this part bores people more than any other because it tinges on tiny details. But briefly, what the Logos said to me was that time is not simply a homogeneous medium where things occur. You can think of it as a fluctuating density of probability, so that though science will tell us what can happen and what cannot happen, we have no theory that explains why, out of everything that could happen, certain things undergo what Whitehead called the formality of actually occurring. And this was what the Logos sought to explain to me. Why, out of all the myriad things that could happen, certain things undergo the formality of occurring. And it is because there is a modular hierarchy of waves of temporal conditioning, or temporal density, or in other words, a given moment, it is more likely for a certain event rated highly improbable. It is more probable at some moments than others. And taking that simple perception and being led by the hand, by the Logos, we were able to construe maps of time, which we run on a computer, and which give a map of the ingression of what I call novelty, the ingression of novelty into time. Now, as a general statement, it's obvious that novelty generally is increasing. It has been since the very beginning of the universe, because first there was only the possibility of nuclear interaction, and then as temperatures fell and below the bond strength of the nucleus, atomic systems could be formed, and then as temperature fell, molecular systems could be formed. Then much later, life became possible, and then as very high life forms, complex life forms evolved, thought became possible, culture was invented, and then with the invention of printing and language, and then printing, and then electronic information movement and this kind of thing. What is happening is there is an ingression of novelty toward what Whitehead, and I took his term, call concrescence. And this is a tightening gyre. Everything is flowing together. And in fact, the man-made lapis, the alchemical stone at the end of time, occurs when everything flows together, when the laws of physics are obviated and the universe disappears, and what is left is the tightly bound plenum, the monad, if you wish, able to express itself for itself, rather than able only to cast a shadow into facies as its reflection. And I come very close here to classical millenarian and apocalyptarian thought. My view of the rate at which change is accelerating and the way the gyre is tightening causes me to think, and the wave predicts this, that it is not long, it is soon. 50 years, 25 years, 35 years, then this event will occur. It is the entry of the species into hyperspace, but it will appear to be the collapse of the state vector and the end of physical laws and the release of the mind into itself. And all these other images, the starship, the space colony, all that, these are precursors. Again, the idea that history is the shock wave of eschatology. As you close distance with the eschatological object, the reflections it is throwing off become more and more true to the thing itself. And in the final moment, God stands revealed. There are no more reflections of the mystery. The mystery in all its nakedness then is seen, and nothing else exists. But what this is, decency can safely scarcely hint.